welcome to the general meeting, 19th of April. I really hope that all of you are starting to, well, assuming everyone's mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, starting to see some spring. And I know, obviously, places like California, you probably don't see anything but spring and summer. But over here, it gets very cold, but it's absolutely beautiful in the UK at the moment. Bright blue skies and loads of flowers out and things. So always helps. So welcome. This is today's agenda. We have going to talk a little bit about the membership, and then I'm going to have Eldon Rammel, who is the TMF Steering Committee Administrator, I think that's his title, talk about steering committee voting and a little bit about the website. We're going to have David Ives is going to talk a little bit about the 2020 survey output and what you wanted from the TMF reference model. And then we're going to have a very interesting session talking about future-proofing the TMF reference model. There's been a lot of discussion at the steering committee, and we wanted to have a very open and transparent conversation with all of you to say, this is where we are today. And Paul Fenton and I are going to be doing that, sort of a bit of tag team doing that. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the MHRA stakeholder meeting, and Russell Joyce is going to be doing that. And then we're going to have the forum feedback of where do I file, and thank you. I've already got a couple of questions, which is great. So rather than people answering them in the chat, what I'll do is I'll hold the questions, but if anybody specifically wants to answer one of those questions, put it in the chat as well, or send me a private message and then I can pass it to you, because you don't want to hear my voice the whole time. And upcoming TMF meetings and next meeting. So let's talk a little bit about the membership. I always do this, but I always think it's nice to remind all. Oh, Fran, thank you. Am I still recording? Hold on. I am recording. Thank you for reminding me. Because I was going to stop it, and then I thought if I stop it, I'll forget. So I am recording. So for all 124 of you on the call, and that's amazing. We started 11 years ago, and 11 years ago we were just it was Lisa and I had a chat, and then we grabbed in Fran and Eldon and Paul and everybody, and this thing grew, and 11 years later we still have 126 people joining, which is fantastic. But we've got a number of different places where people are members. So we've got 315 people as part of the groups.io, which is the active group of people on initiatives. We've got 1,437 subscribers. In other words, they get emails every now and then, they get told about stuff. Our LinkedIn group is 3,500, which is amazing. So if any of you are not, yes, I am sharing a screen, Paul. People can see my screen, can't they? Yeah. If any of you are not members yet, then please do. Join and become part of it. So Eldon, I'm going to hand over to you, if you wouldn't mind, just talking about the steering committee voting process. Feel free to come off your camera and have a chat and tell us about the voting and also about the website.
Okay, will do. Yeah, I won't take up much time because I know we've got a very, very busy agenda for today, but we do have 5 vacancies for the steering committee. So those people who are active members of project teams, initiatives, and registered on groups.io will have received an electronic voting email. We've had a good response so far. It says on the slide 35%. I think we're a little bit above that. But we've got about 5 or 6 hours left of voting. So there are still probably just under 200 people, I think, who are eligible to vote. So if you do want to put your tick against one of your industry colleagues, I really encourage you to hunt out the email from the system that we use and put in your vote before the end of today, UK time. And then we'll send an email around to everybody announcing who the new committee members are. And this is me as well. I've forgotten I've got the next session as well. So yeah, we've had the TMF reference model website in place for probably about 5 or 6 years now. And we've added to it since we first created it. It has changed a little bit here and there, but we think it's probably time for a bit of a refresh. So what we'd like to do is get a few people to contribute to a new team that we've pulled together. You don't have to have any technical know-how, although if you've got experience of maintaining websites and so on, that might be helpful. But it's really thinking about what content should be on the TMF reference model website, how it should be laid out, things like, you know, what makes sense in terms of navigation, the menus, etc. And also how to keep it current. So, you know, if there's things on there that we need to regularly update, what's the process going to be to get information up to date on there? So there's going to be quite a bit of work initially to kind of refresh the website, but then the team will be meeting periodically. You know, that might be every month, it might be every quarter, to make sure that the website is maintained on an ongoing basis. Okay, so we have already set up a new team on groups.io, and the link is at the bottom of the slide there. So if this is something of interest to you and you've got the time to participate, then please do go onto groups.io, click on the link and register to join the team, and we'll get that team going as soon as possible. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you very much, Eldon. As a quick reminder, for those of you who haven't seen the website, it's www.tmfrefmodel.com. Am I sharing my reference model screen now?
You're still sharing PowerPoint at the moment.
Okay, 1 second. I'm just going to do a new share because I need to share my screen. Resume share. There you are. Now you should be seeing the website.
It's still PowerPoint.
Oh, that's very strange. Hang on. Well, still PowerPoint?
Yeah, it doesn't want to share your browser, Karen, for some reason.
It doesn't it? Okay. Let me just try that, and then I'll.
Yep, you've done it.
Hey,
yes.
Excellent! I did it. This is the website. Go and have a look. www.tmfrefmodel.com. There's lots of things on here, and as you know, there's a lot of stuff that we could be doing to maybe make it a little more modern. We can have our resources organized in a slightly different way. There's all sorts of things that we could be doing, and I think it would be really nice to have some people volunteer. So go and join the group, as Eldon said. The other thing you could do, of course, if you wanted to, is you could just volunteer here by putting your name down, and then of course we can always take it and chase you down afterwards, because sometimes it's easier on the spur of the moment just to say, yes, I'll do it. So think about it. If anybody wants to, that'd be fantastic. Okay, so I'm now going to go back to the PowerPoint, and what's the bet? The PowerPoint now doesn't like me. From current slide, resume share. So can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Hey, excellent. Okie dokes, right. So thanks very much, Eldon. What I want to do now is actually talk a little bit about the survey. And David, if I can hand over to you to talk a little bit about what we saw from what people wanted from the survey in 2020.
Yeah, happy to. Hi to everybody. And this is all coming from commentary around what do you guys want to see next. Really, a lot was said. So thank you for all the comments from the group. And I know, you know, we'll have some further discussion about sort of what the steering committee has been talking about after we go through this. So if you want to just go to the next one, Ken. So these are lumped into sort of two categories. And really these are the process requests. So commentary around overall TMF management and oversight. There was a lot of questions about how to make it work. eTMF implementation continues to be something that people are seeking further guidance and support on. Archiving requirements, there was quite a few comments on that as well. Country-specific guidelines, I think this is something that comes up. I know we have some interests depending on where you're geographically located, but it's definitely something that people are struggling with, it seems, across countries. So naming conventions, that one to me is really interesting just because the way that all of our systems work, the naming convention piece may or may not actually even really be an issue for you. It may be more of like a system configuration type thing. Certified copies, I think, just speaking for me personally, we've sort of come up with what we think equates a certified copy process, but I think there's still a lot of questions around the ambiguity of some of the regulatory language there. Document workflows, I can't remember exactly what that was speaking about, but I think this is more just about how the systems can support your processes. CRO, eTMF systems, end of study transfers. Again, just for me personally, it seems like a lot of commentary around, that this is still a big pain point for people. How do they have appropriate oversight when they're in a CRO, eTMF system? And then just thinking about that sort of end of study transfer is quite a task still for a lot of folks. This last one, and I think, Karen, just thinking about the reference model training requests, I think if I remember correctly, this is more about like the adoption of the reference model, right? Like what is the reference model as well, just sort of like the 101, because not everybody's as familiar as some of you are. And
David, the reason I put it in red, which I never told you, is because I wanted to interject here. But I never told you that's what I was going to do. So it's just to let you know that we are recording a couple of videos. One of them is very specifically what's the history of the reference model and sort of a bit more about the reference model, the website, and like the groups and all that sort of stuff. And it's going to be about 20 minutes long, and then we're going to record another one, and it's being done by steering committee members, which is really what is the reference model. Again, 20 minutes, short, sharp. This is the TMF reference model, and they'll be freely available once they're done. So I just wanted to interrupt and say that. So. Back to you.
It's a great interruption, Karen. I know for me, again, just sort of personal experience working with somebody last year and showed them the TMF reference model, just the model itself, and they were like, "Whoa, this is great! I didn't even know that existed." So it's good to continue that. So the content requests, I think some of these we've seen some progress on recently, but also I think these are just trying to think back to the actual textual comments on this. The study types coverage, right? I mean, I know I've seen lots of questions about, depending on the phase or type or of study, what do I actually need? And I think that continues to be a big question for people. On the investigator site file, I know there's lots of sort of different approaches happening in industry on this, but it continues to be a big question, I think, for people. Even sort of like the definition seems to still be a question there. Expanding the model for filing of records related to digital solutions. I think a lot of folks, especially, thinking about this, I think has even been increased more so in the past, year. A lot of people are focused on, okay, let's get, data from other places, but then, how do we accommodate that? Clinical and regulatory, just thinking about the overlap between TMF and submission documents. There's quite a lot. I think everybody's taken sort of different approaches from fully filing all the submissions to only cover letters, et cetera, those kinds of things. So again, continues to be a question coming up in people's minds. Clustering and relationship between artifacts. I think this is something that some people seem to be doing or trying to do, and there are others that are really interested in how the model could help support that. Metadata requirements. Again, for me, this is probably hugely dependent, or the size of this issue might be hugely dependent on what system you're using and your sort of process approach. But just thinking about what's the minimum set of information metadata that you need for each artifact. Making the model a standard, I think this continues to be, has been a big question for people. I personally have experienced a lot of people say that it is a standard and they think of it as such and have tried to adapt it to the T. And then simplification of the structure and presentation. I think some of these comments seem to me around, simplification of the structure, but then also I think partners and people we've worked with, just again, going on personal experience, like it's easy to make the structure larger, right? And trying to keep it more simplified and still adaptable, I think is a big challenge for people. So I lots of commentary, and I think, thanks Karen for trying to distill this down to the points, but thank you as well to the entire team for all the commentary, because it really does help influence what we're thinking about in the direction we're going. I think it's really the next slides, Karen, right?
Yeah, so thank you very much, David. And I have to say that if I look especially at this list, which is the list of things like how do you expand the model, how do you cover different studies, how do you get more relationships, I think this really, really ties into the future, which is what we're going to be talking about. Of course, there will be a survey 2021, I'm assuming, kicking off at some stage as well. So everyone needs to watch this space. So let's talk a little bit about future proofing. And this is, we'd really appreciate you guys, the chats there. As we go through this, put your thoughts, please, into the chat. We really want to understand, this is the reference model that's owned by you guys, and we want to understand how you feel and where we're going to go from here. So just a few key messages from myself, from the steering committee. We are a model that's been made, if you remember, and I'll talk a little about the history, but we've been made by the industry for the industry. And it's us that owns the model. There isn't anybody else that owns the model. In fact, we used to be under the DIA umbrella, and we're now very much an independent entity. The reference model is freely available. There's a website. Everybody gives their time freely. Nobody gets paid for anything. I think we pay a tiny, tiny bit for something to do with the website, and that's about it. And we've been going for 11 years now, coming up to 11 years. And we need to think about the future. We want to make sure that this model carries us through the next 11 years and the 11 years after that. We also want to be very transparent with you as a team. As a group, we want to make sure that everybody understands what we've been thinking, and we want the members to guide where we go. So we're going to be doing things like surveys, etc., but it's very much a what's the next step for the reference model. And a lot of us feel that it's like our baby. We've all grown up with it and we're very fond of it. It comes out in every time anyone's who's on the steering committee especially, but everybody who goes into meetings and things, there's almost like bingo to see if you can say a reference model. So just as a reminder as to how we got here, just for those of you who might be new, or those of you who can't remember, but for those of you who've seen the slide 50 times, sorry. But we started in March 2009, and we started off as a bit of a passionate exploration, I think is the only way of talking it. And we started pulling things together, and suddenly we came up with this model, and then we talked to the regulators, and suddenly it became a little bit more serious, but it was still not managed as a formal thing. It was much more just a little bit haphazard, which is why we then got the steering, besides all the other releases, we had the steering committee established in 2014. We have a charter established. We have a steering committee charter. So we are definitely putting some controls, we put some controls around it. And there's a lot of passion and focus that goes into it. But we then released the exchange mechanism in 2018, which is something which Paul has obviously been leading with others, the exchange mechanism. And this is around standardization. And I think it's things like that and the requests to have all the different types of studies, etc., that's really made us think. So we know as a steering committee that we need to show that we are sustainable, we can keep going for the next 20 years. We also need to stay current, and the world is definitely changing. The TMF world is definitely changing, documents, data, etc., etc. So I'm going to hand over to Paul to talk a little bit about what we've been discussing and what it all means. And guys, please, I really would love some comments from people, even if you just say, that's interesting. Even if if you disagree with anything we say, please, if you want to be controversial, feel free. Because this is your reference model. And there's 138 of you on here who own it. So feel free. But anyway, over to you, Paul.
Great. Thanks, Karen. So as you saw from the slides that David presented, there was kind of a big long list of things that people wanted to see in the reference model. And so we as a steering committee, when we got those results back, put our thinking caps on and started to kind of think, well, how can we do these things? How can we sort of take these things forward? And what should we prioritize? What's going to sort of give the most value back to the community? And as we were doing that, we were sort of realizing that it's quite challenging because of the granularity and the complexity of the TMF. The TMF is quite a complex beast. And the more things we start to try and define and map means that it becomes quite unwieldy to manage all of that in an Excel spreadsheet. We've been using an Excel spreadsheet for the last 11 years, and it's served us well, but we're kind of getting to the limit of that. And especially when we start to think about mapping to other models or having a much more comprehensive set of metadata, or even things like relationships between artifacts, all of a sudden the complexity becomes exponential. And so one thing that we were sort of exploring was, well, how could we sort of move maybe to something which is a little bit more technologically advanced to manage? And I'll speak to that in a moment. The other thing that we were thinking about is obviously the exchange mechanism and the fact that the exchange mechanism aims to be a standard to allow the easy exchange of content and TMF information between organizations and systems. We spent a good 2 years, if not more, defining this standard, which we had high hopes for. We thought that the industry would jump on it because obviously, as we saw in the survey, the transfer of content, especially at the end of the study, is still a challenge. And also in the future, as we start to go more and more towards data rather than documents and having many more systems, it's also going to be really important that we have ways and means of exchanging information between organizations. And so what we want to sort of understand, and that's why we recently did a survey, was, well, what's blocking the industry from adopting the exchange mechanism? And I think we've got some ideas, but we really need to start to think about standardization, and not just of the exchange mechanism, but maybe also of the whole reference model itself. The other thing that for us is important is obviously having a voice with the regulators and having involvement in some of the initiatives that are sort of underway. And I'm thinking especially about ICH E6R3 and those kinds of things where there's focus being put on what kind of essential documents which should we have, what kind of content should we have in a TMF, and then also what should be defined in the regulations. And that's, I think, a really big question, and I think it's really important that we do have a voice as a community, because I think we definitely are a very large community, and I think that we have very strong opinions as to what we think we should be seeing in the regulations. And then finally, the other thing that we've been talking about is governance and funding, and how we can ensure the long-term longevity or perennity of the model, and also find ways of funding initiatives, because as we see that we're adding more and more into the model, or people are asking us, the community is asking us to add more and more into the model, we need to start to be able to use more sophisticated tools, for example. And the problem is that these things cost money. And right now, as Karen said, we're purely voluntary. There's no membership fees or anything like that within the reference model. And that's fine to a certain extent, but if we want to go further, well, sometimes we may need to be able to fund things, and so that's something that we've also been thinking about. Karen, next slide. So as a steering committee, we've taken it upon ourselves to start to think about this in more detail, and also, more importantly, to get community feedback from you guys. It's important that you have your say, because ultimately the model belongs to you. And so we're going to be thinking about, well, what are the different things that we could do to ensure the perennity and, evolve the model and meet the industry requirements, and also adapt to the future. And so we have sort of various different options, I think, available to us. The first thing is that we could actually just do nothing and carry on as we are. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think it's fine to do that, but we just need to realize that there may be some limitations in terms of how many different initiatives we can take on. We could also try and find ways of funding new initiatives and tools, as well as formalizing the TMF reference model organization. As you know, today, there is no formal entity. We're not a non-for-profit organization. We don't really have a legal entity, and that has certain challenges, notably in terms of funding, but even for things like standardization. And so we're thinking very carefully about that, and that's not necessarily a simple thing to do, right, to put that kind of thing in place, but we are thinking about it. We're also thinking about other standards organizations that exist out there in the industry that we could maybe partner with or associate with, because they quite often are funded. They do have an entity, and they've got resources, they've got tools, that we could potentially use. And so that's something that we're also thinking very carefully about. Are there bodies out there that could be a good fit for us to associate with? And then we don't have all of the answers, right? We've only really just started to think about this. So there could be other things that we can do to future-proof the reference model. And we really want to hear from you as a community to have your thoughts and see if you have ideas about things that we could do to be able to move this thing forward. And so one of the things that we're going to start to put together in the next few months is a survey directly on this subject, which we'll send out to you guys so that you can provide us with feedback. And for us, transparency is extremely important. Any things that we're doing, of course, we want you to be aware of, and that's why we're talking about this today. And we very much value your thoughts and ideas on how do we take all of the good work that we've done as a community and ensure that we can safeguard that, but also that we can evolve it and properly manage and maintain it. So I'm going to pass things back to Karen. I can see there's a whole bunch of comments, and Karen, maybe you want to take the comments. Karen, we can't hear you.
Hold on, yes, it's a bit of a joint effort. Sorry, your dog was barking and mine started.
Okay.
So I'm going to pick up some of the comments, but I'm going to throw some questions back to you as well, Paul, because I think some of the comments are really interesting. I mean, there's obviously a lot of people thinking that some of these things would be very, very useful. For example, Adam was saying about linking to a unified ISF reference model, and this all ties back to how do you get things to talk to each other. There was one question from Jennifer about other platforms being considered rather than Excel. Todd, thank you very much for putting an answer down, saying obviously that we're not actually looking at a specific platform. But Paul, I wondered if you wanted to just give a little bit of insight into your sort of database thoughts, just you know, just to give a bit
Yeah.
why, and also the fact that we all appreciate that Excel is an excellent tool and that we're not going to dump Excel. It's more about, do you want to just explain that concept?
Yeah, sure. So Kathy Clark, who's also a steering committee member, and myself took it upon ourselves to look into alternate ways of storing and presenting information for the reference model. And this came about because we were sort of undergoing several mapping exercises, notably around real world trials, but also around ISF. And we were realizing that we can't just keep adding columns to the spreadsheet. You know, after a while, it's just going to become too unwieldy. And so we started to look into how we could structure a database, and we did an exercise in Microsoft Access, which obviously is quite old now, but you know, it's pretty easy, pretty user friendly, and we started to sort of work out, okay, well, how can we take that spreadsheet and then make it multi-dimensional so that we can have relationships between you know, the different data points. So for example, you know, if I have a sub artifact that could be used in multiple artifacts, well, you know, with a database, you can have things that are multi-dimensional, and you'd be able to say, well, show me all of the artifacts that this sub artifact relates to. Or you know, you could also have like filtering, so show me all of the artifacts that are also present in an ISF. So these kinds of things we were thinking about. And then we also wanted to be able to do outputs. So we wanted to be able to do sort of on-screen outputs, but also do Excel spreadsheet outputs, because obviously people kind of like to work with Excel. And the idea would be that if we had a central database, we could then export to Excel a subset of what we've kind of filtered within that database. The other thing that we were thinking about is change control. So, you know, we have a change control board within the reference model, and change control you know, requires proper impact assessment, and it also requires, you know, sort of standardization and harmonization. And so we're also thinking that this database tool could also be a useful tool for the change control board, for them to be able to do proper impact assessment when people request changes to, you know, artifacts or zones or metadata or any of the things that exist in the reference model. And especially if we start to implement other initiatives like you know, a more broad set of metadata, or, you know, defining relationships between artifacts and clustering and all of those kinds of things, you know, the change control board are going to have some kind of tool to make it easier for them to be able to do that impact assessment. Now, we did do a sort of an initial prototype, but we stopped because we realized that MS Access isn't really, you know, going to cut it. We do need to have maybe something a little bit more sophisticated, and also, you know, we're not database designers or database administrators or even software developers or software integrators, and so, you know, we also had a limit in terms of our knowledge to be able to do this kind of thing. And ideally, if you were going to undertake something like that, you'd probably work with a third party or a vendor who's specialized in that. And that kind of triggered some of the discussions that we had about the fact that we want to do these things and we need a better platform, but at the same time, we don't really have any resources. We don't have any sort of financial resources or any human resources to be able to do these things. And that's kind of what spurred some of the discussion around future-proofing as well. Does that make sense, Karen?
Yeah, no, absolutely perfect description. I think interesting, Michael, Hermes, you mentioned about working with the naming conventions and having them dynamically linked to the reference model. And to support something like that, you really need more than an Excel spreadsheet, because otherwise, how on earth would you actually capture all that information? But also to the point that you raised in terms of sort of funding, and I know, Rosemary, you were saying, you mentioned something about, you know, getting the end users and have a societies waiving fees and you know, that will help. I do apologize. That will help for in terms of getting the message out. I think the challenge that we've got is, how do we actually get the money in? I think I think I'm going to quote Fran Ross and say, anyone got $1 million for us, because then, you know, that might actually help us able to get but probably nobody, if they've got $1 million, wants to necessarily spend it on the reference model. So we are definitely at a crossroads in terms of what do we do. And as Paul said, you know, we've got 4 different options in front of us. I'm sure there's others. We're going to be asking all of you the opinion. Jeremy Johnson, I think you made a comment about getting FDA input and being very helpful. And one of the things that we struggle with is having people listen to us. Because, you know, ICH G6R3, we want to get there, but we're sort of pulled in sort of around the corner under the curtains by one of our members who happens to be in a big pharma company that's at the table. And we're not at the table because we are not recognized. So somehow we need to think about things like that as well. So hopefully that's given you guys a bit of an idea as to what we're thinking, where we are. If anyone has any thoughts or wants to even contribute ideas, this is your reference model. Just you can put in the chat or ping me, kroy@flexglobal.com, and we can have a chat so we can take it forward from here. It's exciting times.
Can I just add something, Karen? Also,
yeah,
I think
of course.
one thing that's really important to us is that we still maintain this model, you know, by the industry for the industry. And so whatever's done, you know, the goal is not to start to, you know, like charge people to use it or anything like that. I think, you know, we definitely want to have free distribution. We just need to find ways of being able to take it forward. I think that's important to underline, just in case anyone's worried.
Agree.
All right.
Anybody else got any? Well, anyway, feel free, obviously, to add comments as we go. If anybody's got any other thoughts, then, you know, that's great. And if anybody wants to, as I said, if anybody wants to get involved, then, or speak up. Is there anybody who wants to say anything? I don't know whether Fran or Lisa or so anybody else from the steering committee or anybody wants to add anything.
Hey, I was just adding it into the chat. Thank you, Karen. This is Lisa, everyone. And Paul, thank you for adding that bit in because, you know, as we started this initiative, it was so that the TMF reference model was accessible and available to everyone so that we could, and all companies in our industry, so that we could, you know, further our document management and, you know, practices and policies for TMF so that we were maintaining it and calling it and managing it the same. So as we are looking at this, as Paul said, know that we are making sure that we are staying true where we can, as much as we can, or all that we can, to that founding principle. Okay, everyone. So don't immediately worry that we don't have everybody's back because it would become something that would be paid for. That's what that would be brought back to all of our constituents to know if you know where we are if that would ever happen. But we just want to stay true to that founding principle.
Absolutely, and I think I totally agree with you, Lisa, and that's why one of the key messages, it's free and available, and it should stay and will stay so. As in, it needs to be available for everybody to everybody. So, and thank you, Todd, for your comments. Anybody else want to make anything before we move on? Fantastic. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. So thank you very much, Paul. And the next topic is the MHRA stakeholders meeting. Russell and I attended this. I thought it was a very interesting meeting. And Russell, thank you very much for agreeing to present some of the findings.
You're welcome, Karen. Thank you very much. So as Karen said, it's a very interesting meeting. As for most of us, the MHRA has had an unprecedented year, not least because of the impact of Brexit, but also because of COVID-19, which has both accelerated the transition to remote monitoring, but also prioritised inspections for COVID-19 treatments. So the MHRA is adopting a pragmatic approach and accommodating the differing needs of the inspector and the organisations it's inspecting. Sorry, could we move on to the next slide, please, Karen? Thank you. And this seems to have worked because more than 30 GCP inspections have been carried out and findings have been raised. So the usual notice for inspections is still being given, but often take longer. And this is due to a number of things, including technical challenges, as well as the inability to ask questions in real time. The inspection scope tends to be narrower, and this is largely because of the inspector's inability to access premises, equipment and facilities as they normally would with an on-site inspection. The inspectors like to stress that they were still motivated to continue applying standards of compliance despite all these changings, but there has been a collaborative approach in discussing these challenges with remote inspections, and there is a plan to publish a reflection paper on those current experiences. There is currently an international coalition of medicines regulatory authorities who are working on inspections, which is chaired by the MHRA and includes global regulators such as the FDA, Health Canada and Swissmedic. So that will be being published fairly shortly. Next slide, please, Karen. So under discussion were Econsent, source data verification, electronic health record guidance, ICHE 6R3 and new guidance on the TMF scheduled from December 2021. If I go first to ICHE 6, which Paul has just spoken about, that's currently undergoing extensive review, and Gail Francis and Andy Fisher are part of the expert working group representing the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme, or PICS as some may know it. That's estimated to be ready for consultation by December 2021 and full adoption by the end of November 2022. This will include major revisions to data governance, monitoring, and more on proportionality, emphasis on the reliability of trial results rather than the accuracy of every single data point, and focus on involvement of subjects in trial design and electronic systems. Many of you will be aware that we are still awaiting implementation of Regulation EU 536/2014, which should have come into force on the 31st of December last year, but due to technical difficulties with the development of the EU clinical trials portal and database, that implementation continues to be delayed. However, it's expected to come into force in December 2021, and perhaps most notable for us is Article 58, which will require the retention of the trial master file for 25 years from the end of the clinical trial, although that end date isn't specified. It's for each organisation to define that for themselves. So there were some discussions around the use of Econsent in clinical trials and how this could be achieved. The MHRA introduced a tool which has been developed by the European CRO Federation to guide those wishing to implement such a solution. The MHRA stressed that it's important to ensure that monitors have access to the Econsent system when conducting their reviews, but there should be adequate controls in place to ensure that the sponsor cannot access any personal identifiable data. It's also important to be careful to consider how these systems are integrated. For example, there should be controls in place to prevent any personally identifiable information being integrated into an EDC system. And there was a reminder too of the importance of considering the use of Econsent in the trial risk assessment. For example, it may be that Econsent may not be appropriate in some populations or situations where the internet connection is unstable or unavailable. In terms of remote source data verification, there was a comment that remote monitoring can save time and allow the inclusion of additional SMEs, although it was also noted that principal investigators are less likely to engage with remote visits than in-person visits. So the ad hoc deployment of remote monitoring techniques here creates an element of risk and so risk assessments should be undertaken. There may not be a need to repeat SDV unless there was less confidence in the data itself. If there was a good rationale, then source data verification may not need to be repeated. If it was critical data with no follow-up on site, then mitigation would be required, which would rely on the robustness of the remote SDV process. Useful to know that the Association of CROs has developed a quality by design manual for decentralized trials in relation to the remonitoring of data subject to remote SDV. Also on the agenda, the MHRA provided an update to the current guidance on electronic health records that included, amongst other things, plans to develop guidance on source data aspects within investigator sites, such as source data agreements, as well as data held in other electronic systems such as EPRO. An announcement of a new statement expected in April 2021 that will expand the existing 2020 MHRA, HRA and ICO position paper on direct on-site access of monitors to electronic health records to include remote access. This will specifically address situations in which a monitor or auditor has their own login to the system, but does not have use to a document sharing platform. And there was also an announcement of the creation of a new electronic health record stakeholder group, combining a patient engagement group. So keep your eyes open for that one too. That's it from me, Karen.
I have to say, thank you very much, Russell. I have to say that the electronic health record guidance surprised me, because the MHRA have always said they don't want people even accessing electronic systems unless you're on site, which doesn't seem to make any sense, because if you're on site, there's not the advantage of electronic system. But they were definitely talking about having these electronic health records that people could access from off-site, and they were talking about how you would access it and the controls and the trainings and all the rest of it. So I wonder whether the whole remoteness of the world in the last year has made them change their minds about what you can access from a distance versus what you can't. So it will be interesting to see, and they did actually put out a call for anybody who wanted to get involved in the electronic health record guidance. So I don't know whether you needed to be on the stakeholder group to get involved, but they did say they were looking for people who were specifically focused in that area. Well, I thought it was a really interesting meeting, actually.
It was. And if anybody is interested, the HSRAA, the Health Services Records and Archives Association, has now been granted permission to consult on EHR. So if you'd like to have a voice on that and don't have a voice through any other means, please join us on the HSRAA. We'll be pleased to hear from you. Fantastic.
That's great. We'll feed our stuff back through you then, Russell.
Thank you.
So, excellent. Okay, so thank you, Jamie, for putting the website up for HSRA, because obviously Jamie is also on the organising committee, board of HSRA. So I was going to leave a bit of time to see whether we had, I didn't know how much time we were going to have, whether we were going to run out of time or have no time. And actually we're about perfect. We've got a few minutes to look at questions, just general questions that you have. There's a couple of things that have come up already. I'm just going to go back to them. Lisa, I'm going to actually ask you if you're around, since you owned the safety zone. I wonder whether are you there? I wonder if you'll be able to answer the question from Vanessa.
Hi, I'm here.
So Vanessa asked the question, if safety documents are being filed in the Argus system, should they be filed into the TMF as well? And knowing that you, as I said, knowing that's your zone, I wondered if you wanted to just give some insight into the whole safety documents, TMF, etc.
Sure. So the trick with, if I might give a little background into the question, because it's not an easy question, is that safety documentation is often stored in an alternative repository, right? And that is often Argus. And that documentation is usually not stored in a study-specific organizational manner. It is often by product. although a study is a metadata field on the documentation. And then depending on how different companies use Argus, it may be a database, but it also may be a doc base as well. And it would hold very fairly, it may hold some patient-specific information. So what do? One, we identify it as a external repository. We do know that people that cannot get general access to Argus because it unblinds studies, because often the information within Argus is blinded. So the first thing we have to do is we have to understand that it is an external to the trial master file, maybe system repository. Two, you have to identify who needs access to that and what information would be needed for the general team. And so maybe you transfer some information during the conduct of the study. Let's just say the COMs that needs to be distributed to health authorities or investigators. And then three, I would say you have to look at the long-term repository, because you have to ensure that that content is able to be locked, just like it feeds into the other repositories or the other requirements for an eTMF. So you have to look at, maybe at the end of the study, you're going to export it. You're going to then be able to put it into the trial master file or its own digital preservation. But you still have to do have to make sure that that content is digitally preserved at the study level for 30 plus years or 25 plus years. So do I say you have to put it in during the conduct of the study? No, but you have to identify it. Two, you have to put in what is needed to be transmitted, and transferred and distributed out to the sites. And three, you still have to recognize it as a repository, and you have to recognize that that content has to go through a locking and archiving process.
Thank you very much, Lisa, much appreciated. We don't have a lot of questions come in. We do have one which, completely different question. Kathy, you asked about if the MHRA were going to give out some documentation from that meeting. Russell, I thought they were, but I was just looking in I haven't seen anything. They're not, very quietly, they're not always the best at following up with written documentation on these things.
Yep, I've just put something in the chat, Karen, so you can find it on Asset Publishing, but also the RQA has a very comprehensive summary as well.
Fantastic, thank you very much. That's wonderful. I wasn't trying to knock the MHRA. Just sometimes they don't. That's great. And then there was one other question which came right at the beginning. So for those of you who asked, there was a question around, does anyone have an eTMF implementation plan or resource for training? Now, obviously this is a TMF reference model call. There are lots and lots of people that help with eTMF implementations, and whether they're consultants or companies, etc. From a TMF reference model perspective, we have a TMF reference model implementation and a TMF reference model guide, but we don't have an eTMF implementation plan, and it's really outside of our remit. But I would suggest if you find the good consultants and good companies to go and ask them, and I'm sure they'll be able to help you. There was a question, hold on, oh, they're all coming in so fast, it's all moving. There was a question about scanning apps. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to be asking about scanning apps. It came to me. Basically saying, are people using scanning apps to collect documents? And are we only left with the eTMF app since they directly upload to the study inbox? And I think the question is it okay to use scanning apps to upload documents into your or to scan documents to put them into the eTMF? I've got a couple of thoughts, and then I'm sure somebody else will want to raise your hand if you want to answer it. But I know one of the things I think you'll be very careful about is where do the images sit? So one of the things that the eTMF vendors will be doing is making sure that those images don't get stuck on a device from a security perspective. So just a normal scanning app might just scan it and it'll sit on your phone, and then you have to get rid of it yourself. But I don't know if there's anybody want to put their hand up and give some thoughts about scanning apps? And there are a few others. So I haven't got anything yet, but there are a few other questions. Absolutely, Fran, is the question, is the image Alcoa? I love the fact the C's gone on the end. Alcoa sounded much easier to say. And there was another question, which is, are there any standard guidances for e-signatures that are accepted by TMF? Well, that's a very, very, very big question around e-signatures, and maybe, I'll go plus or plus. Maybe what we should be doing is thinking about for the future, thinking about topics. So we'll take these and think about topics for next meetings. Lisa, the topic you raise about MS Team chats and content for the TMF, there's a lot of stuff people are talking about that. Maybe we should actually have a little bit of a discussion around that at one of the next meetings, because I quite like that idea. On the basis that we've got 1 minute to go, and I think that's absolutely perfectly timed to say that there are some TMF events coming up, and there's the TMF Summit is May 2021, the week before the Clinical Document World Inspection Readiness in May 2021. So for us vendors, we're going to be at all of them, and for the rest of you, you can pick between them. HSRAA have a virtual meeting in September 2021, and the first one that I know of that's in person, that's TMF related, is the Fierce TMF Summit in person. And what I should have put in there is that it's in New Orleans. Yeah, absolutely. My thought exactly, Fran. New Orleans. So I don't know about you guys, but I'm quite happy for my first trip to be to New Orleans. So it would be great if we could do that. And then a Clinical Document World, not that I'm knocking the Clinical Document World, whoopsie, in New Jersey in November 2021. So fantastic for New Orleans, and thank you very much for everybody voting, and thank you very much for the 2 people that have volunteered for the website. Anybody else who wants to go to the website, put your note down. Anybody else who wants to be involved in anything else, shout. And a reminder that the next meeting is on the 7th of June. So without further ado, I'd just like to say thank you very, very much, and have a good day. And I'm going to do this is now my tradition. I'm going to sing you out with, well, I'm not going to sing you out, clearly. I'm going to play some music, if it would actually work. Typical. There you are.